Some More Outdoor, Episode 4.
Welcome to Some More Outdoor, where we speak with authors, entrepreneurs, and business owners about how the outdoors has affected their life and their projects. This show is to remind you of the healing properties of the outdoors. So, are you ready to learn what the nature effect can do for your life? Well, here's your host, Brett Trout.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Some More Outdoor. I'm your host, Brett Trout, and this is the podcast dedicated to reminding you to get out and experience the nature effect. My goal is to help you reestablish a connection with nature so you can live with childlike wonder again. And today, I'm so excited to introduce my special guest, Jody Maberry. Hi, Jody. How you doing today?
I'm doing good, Brett. Thanks. I like that childhood wonder. I think I'm full of that most days.
You sound like it. So Jody is a former park ranger who is now a business and marketing consultant. He is the host of the Park Leader Show and is on a mission to change the landscape of leadership in our national parks or just in parks in general. He can count the number of times he has seen a fox on one finger. Jody, love that. So giving a little overview of you and your business. So why don't you go ahead and take it away and share with us who you are and what you do?
Well, my big thing right now is Park Leaders, which is centered around the Park Leaders Show. So I host this show that talks to park leaders in national parks, state parks, all across the country. We've just had some tremendous guests on the show sharing their experience, talking about leadership and how they do what they do and why they do what they do. And it's just had a great response. It's as that tagline you shared, changing the landscape of leadership. That's the goal there, to take my experience in business and my experience as a park ranger and blend them together to try to help bring up the next generation of leaders in parks.
That's so awesome to hear. And how long were you a park ranger for?
8 years.
8 years? And I'm
Yes.
sure it was an amazing experience.
Oh, it sure was. It's about the best job you could ask for. It was, and if there was a day I didn't remember how lucky I was to be a park ranger, usually somebody, a park visitor, would remind me. I'm not exaggerating when I say there has been hundreds of times where somebody would stop me and say, hey, this is my dream job. How'd you become a park ranger? And then they would tell me their story of how they always meant to become a park ranger, but something, whatever it was, you could insert a different situation, got in the way, and they ended up an accountant or whatever else, sitting in a cubicle when they always wanted to be a park ranger.
Right. Well, now that I'm free from the job that I had for 12 years and living so close, I'm in Clovis, California, which is, I've got Kings Canyon, Sequoia, and Yosemite all within 90 minutes driving time. Oh. And I love being up there and going up there. And that's where I do my previous podcast show. That's where I was doing a lot of my shows. And but I've always been looking into the park ranger aspect of it because I think it would just be a blast. I was up there about a month and a half ago, and I went to one of the stores in Yosemite Valley. There was a checkout person at one of the stores, and I said, you must love working up here. And the guy looks at me and he says, I guess. I said, what do you mean you guess? I said, where are you from? He's like, Los Angeles. I'm like, this is so much better than Los Angeles. And he's like, well, yeah, I guess. And I'm like, man, have some passion for where you're at. This is, he was a young kid. And so I'm sure as he gets older, he'll remember that time in his life when he got to work in Yosemite, when he's working in a cubicle somewhere.
Yeah.
And, doing that. So, well, it's a great story. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me. As I said in the beginning, and you commented on, is my goal is to help people, like I said, reestablish their connection with nature, like we were when we were kids, so we can live with that passion, we can live with that childlike wonder again. And so one of the first questions that I have after we go into the quote about nature is telling a story about your childhood. So I'm looking forward to hearing that as well. But I like to start off my shows because everybody loves quotes. Everybody loves shares a lot of different nature quotes on Pinterest and on Facebook with scenery. And I'm not sure what it is. I haven't figured it out yet. Even me, I have a picture of Yosemite right above my desk right now Yosemite Valley that I took. And it's just something about these pictures that we take that inspire us and then share quotes with others about quotes that inspire us and have an impact. So if you found one, what was your favorite nature quote or mantra? And how can S'more Outdoor listeners apply this quote to their life?
The quote that I have is from a Northwest author, Robert Michael Pyle. And he said, when people connect with nature, it happens somewhere. Almost everyone who cares deeply about the outdoors can identify a particular place where contact occurred. And what I like about that is it goes so well with a message I've been trying to get across in park leaders, is that Theodore Roosevelt had the North Dakota Badlands, what is now Theodore Roosevelt National Park. That's where he connected with nature. And everybody has their Badlands somewhere. So I try to get that message across to park leaders, is your park could be the Badlands for somebody. That could be where they connect and where it all begins for them. So you owe it to those park visitors to make your park the best it can be and their experience the best that it can be. And to somebody that's not in the parks and recreation profession, that still ties in the way that you connect somewhere. And if you haven't found it yet, just keep exploring. It could be a certain river you just haven't visited yet. It could be Yosemite. Maybe it's a different part of Yosemite you haven't been to. So just keep exploring and you are going to find your Badlands.
Well, I love that, how you incorporated finding the Badlands. And it may be even in somebody's own backyard, not literally in the backyard, but in their backyard around where they live. And it brings me back to a story that I shared with Kevin Miller the other day. When I moved back home from San Diego, I had been wanting to go travel abroad, study abroad, and see the world as somebody, 20, 21-year-old. I ended up moving back home, and some buddies of mine had taken me hiking up in the mountains where I'd grown up, where I'd never been because I worked and went to school all the time. And that was the first day that we went up there, that was when I understood that was my Badlands, because I understood I didn't need to go see the world. I hadn't even explored my own backyard yet. But yes, definitely. That's something that I think everybody should definitely find and keep looking for until you find that, as you say, your Badlands. Yeah. So I love how you say that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So going to childhood memory, because I want people to be able to express themselves and to be able to live with that childlike wonder again. Like I do when I'm out in nature, I just smile and have fun and just enjoy life out there. Can you tell us a story from your childhood about your experience in the outdoors and really take us to that time in your life and tell us that story?
When I was a kid, we used to go camping a lot as a family, mostly out west. And so I grew up with an eye towards the west. I grew up in Illinois near the Kickapoo Creek. So I would spend a lot of time playing on the banks of the creek and in the woods. There was I don't know why it was called this, but there was a particular big area of wooded land around the Kickapoo Creek called the Pit. And the neighborhood kids and I would play in the Pit a lot. So I have a lot of time outdoors as a child, but really there was one experience that when I was a little bit older, when I was a teenager, that really set it off for me. A good friend, Kevin Jury, we went with my father on a canoeing trip on the Current River in Missouri. And we spent 1 or 2 nights on the river, and I had forgot my sleeping bag on the bus, and so had to sleep without a bag. And it was just so much fun. The weather was great. We had a really good time. And that set it off for me. Kevin Jury and I ended up canoeing every creek or river we could find in central Illinois after that. We ended up canoeing in later years in Wyoming through Teton National Park. So anywhere I could start floating, I did. So it was that trip on the Current River with the beautiful scenes and surrounded by, when you canoe, you're likely to see the outdoors in a way that you won't otherwise, because you can just float along quietly, and birds and deer and wildlife don't know you're there. And so you capture some scenes that you may not otherwise see. And that led to me then becoming a trip coordinator with the outdoor program at Illinois State University, where I went to college. And that led to more float trips and bigger trips. But it all came back to that first Current River trip that just set it off. And it was actually floating rivers and creeks that brought me back as a teenager, brought me back to spending time in the outdoors like I did when I was younger.
That's awesome. I love to hear that story and how it progresses, how it's progressed into who you are today, which I would love to talk about a little later on in the show about your park, becoming a park ranger. But canoeing is such a fun sport, and it's I guess you would call it a sport, depending on what your kind of canoeing rivers you're going in and stuff. But I love canoeing, and I think that, like you said, you're in the river. The wildlife doesn't know that you're around, and so to be able to capture that and to that environment and that them and their natural surroundings is some of the most beautiful things you can come across in nature. So I love that. Thank you for sharing that story with us.
Yeah.
And the next question that I'd like to find out from people about, because I have them and I know that everybody else does, was a time, the Current River it set you up for your life in the outdoors. But there's always some of these, and there's probably many that you have been to as a park ranger. But what was one of the most beautiful places that you had ever been to, and how that place kind of really impacted your life and how nature had an effect on you during that time?
Well, I told you how that Current River trip sent me down the path where eventually becoming involved in the outdoor program at Illinois State University. And one of the trips I took with them was a cross-country skiing camping trip at Yellowstone National Park in the winter. And it was horribly beautiful. It was so cold, but it was unlike anything I've seen before or since. Because if you've been to Yellowstone, you realize it's a wondrous place. But to be there in the winter is something completely different. And then what we did is we skied in. It took about a full day to get to our camp where we set up. And then we just set up a base camp for the week and spent a week camping out there. Other than a plane that flew over every so often, which we later found out was an IMAX plane because they were making their film about wolves while we were there. But other than seeing that plane fly over a few times during the week, we didn't see another person. We didn't hear another person. And the snow kept everything so quiet. It was almost so quiet it was loud, if that makes sense. And the beauty of being deep in Yellowstone along Slough Creek in the winter was incredible. And I made friends. Some of the people on the trip were people I had not met before. And one of them, we became such good friends that after college, once we both graduated, we took out on a 60-day trip through the West. And that was just incredible. But every trip I've ever done since then is always compared to that Yellowstone trip, or in some way it ties back to that Yellowstone trip, because it was just incredible. The most beautiful place I've ever been.
Well, and to be able to spend a week out there?
Yes.
To be able to spend a week in an environment like that with nobody around, and like you said, your description of the place, I'm thinking about it. Gosh, could I even handle being out there in the freezing cold? And maybe not nowadays, but when I was younger, I might have been able to do something like that. But that's, very, very descriptive, and you really took me there in that story, because, I could feel your sense of energy and just the way it makes you feel. And it's so hard to describe that to people who have never been outdoors or who have never experienced something like that. And so that's what I love about this show, is that people like yourself are going to be able to come on and help get that message out there and help get the inspiration out there, even if it's, maybe some of the listeners will never spend a week in Yellowstone during the winter. but they've heard your story and are at least inspired to get out. So definitely thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. And that may not be a good story to inspire people to get outside, because it was brutally cold. I don't know how cold it got. My thermometer broke one night when it got to 20 below.
Oh, wow.
So it got awfully cold. But during the day when the sun was out, it was
amazing.
Just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing.
And I was young enough to not know better, and I thought, well, it's the snow. I don't even need to put on sunscreen, and I got the worst sunburn I've ever got.
Oh, man. I could imagine on that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the next question that I sent you, I talk about with the nature effect, and it's just something that I had come up with. It was a simple solution to how nature impacts me. So I call it, the nature effect. How does that have the nature effect have an impact in your life today? Now that you're not a park ranger anymore, how does the nature effect have an impact in your life and business today?
Well, that's a bit of a struggle. I didn't realize one of the effects I didn't realize when I was a park ranger is how being out in nature every day just constantly gave me that nature effect. And I didn't sit in a chair very much. I was outside as much as I possibly could. And now that I'm no longer a park ranger, the ways that I feel the lack of it sometimes more than I actually feel the nature effect. So having been in it for so long, it's really easy to pick out what it does. And it kept me more fit to be outdoors all the time. Now that I'm not outdoors, it's easier to get grumpier being inside a lot. It's just very recharging to be outside. And when you're out there, when you're out in nature, it's not about you, it's about whatever else is going on. Where if I'm inside, it's real easy to think about or even create problems that I have. But outside, you can just stop and watch a salamander or a beetle, and that's all that matters at the time. And so the nature effect makes a difference to me in that it just recharges. My mentor in parks, Jack Hart, I remember when I first started, and I was just asking him about parks. The same type of questions I ask people on the Park Leader Show, just their experience with parks and why are parks important. And he said, I don't remember exactly how he said it, but he said something along the lines of, people come to parks to recreate and to recreate. And I thought, boy, I didn't get it at the time, but the more I spent in parks, and I realized that the park I was at the time was a large state park very close to Spokane, Washington, which has about 115,000 people. And so many people, that was where they recharged or recreated during the weekend. They'd have a tough week, and then they'd come out and play in the park. Or even during the week, they'd finish work and they'd come out and play in the park. And prior to being a park ranger, I was a financial analyst at a commercial bank. And in between where I worked and where I lived is Deception Pass State Park, which is one of the most beautiful spots in Washington State. And when the weather permitted, I would stop at Deception Pass after work, and I would hike until it got dark and just play around on the beaches or the trails or in the trees and then go home. So there was an example of where I had a job where you wore a shirt and tie to work and sat in a cubicle, but yet I could get that nature effect on my way home, and it made a big impact. I looked forward to it I would probably do that 3 or 4 times a week in the summer. And then we get lousy weather in Washington in the winter, so I didn't do it quite as much then.
Right. No, and what I love about you sharing that is that, well, first of all, yes, you've felt the lack of the nature effect now after being a park ranger and being indoors and doing that. But one thing that you brought us back to is when you were working in the financial, for a bank, you said,
yes.
Just being able to, instead of rushing home to get home, And I used to do the same thing when I worked in a pawn shop in Santa Barbara. But back in the 90s, I didn't have the internet, and it wasn't so distracting back then as well for me to just rush home and get on the internet. But we would watch a lot of TV. But like you say, you made a point to be able to get out and experience nature on your way home from work before we get home. But in today's age, I think people are just constantly, go to work, come home, they're in traffic, and then they want to get home and just relax. And that's why I think this message is so important, to be able to help people understand that even if it's one day a week, to be able to get out on your way home and take a different drive home from work, and maybe even go sit in a local park. Most cities do have, even most neighborhoods now have a little park that has trees and stuff that you can get out rather than just sitting. But like you said, during the wintertime up there, when it would rain and stuff, you could still at least get outside on your porch and listen to the rain, and do that. And that still has an impact. And that's what I want to help people understand too, is even just sitting outside in your backyard can have that. It can have the nature effect. It can have an impact in your life. I want to jump into the inspiration for your podcast, for your business, the Park Leader Show. What inspired you to actually start that show, being in the marketing realm that you're in? Was it something that you had always wanted to do, or just something that you thought, I need to start bringing this information out there because nobody's doing it?
Well, a couple of things brought it by. It started after I left Parks. I went back to school to get an MBA. And by the time I was done at the end of that 2 years, I was kind of feeling the itch about Parks again, but had just went back and got an MBA and wasn't really interested in becoming a park ranger again at the time. So I kept thinking, well, what can I do to help parks? And I got this idea of combining my experience from being in the business world and getting an MBA with my experience as a park ranger, and because I had been anything from entry-level campground ranger up to an assistant park manager, and realized, well, there are some gaps in what takes place. There's some gaps in some training, and it's difficult if you want to choose yourself to be a leader to find an avenue to learn more and do more. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do that. And I remember exactly where I was when being an entrepreneur, when you get an idea like that, one of the first things you do is get the domain name. Mm-hmm. So I remember where I was when I bought that domain name, and then I still didn't quite know what to do with it. And then my friend Jared Easley had me be a guest host on his podcast. And I realized, this is doable. Maybe this is an avenue I can do with park leaders to start it off and to build an audience and to reach people and make connections. And so that's where it came about. A tax day on 2014, April 15th, 2014, I launched it, starting with people that I knew from being a park ranger, and then have branched out from there. And I've just had some fantastic guests, just people that without the podcast, I may have never had a connection with. Mm-hmm. So it's really steamrolled. And my most recent episode at the time of us recording this is the managing director of Ontario Provincial Parks. And getting the chance to talk to people like that is tremendous, not just for me, but for the listeners of the show that may never have met somebody like that or get the chance to spend 30 minutes with them. When I started my hiring, the manager that hired me, Jack Hart, he would spend lunch hours with me or time during the day just answering questions. And that's kind of what the show is based on, is those conversations I had with Jack Hart. Well, now anyone that listens to the show has an opportunity to sit in on those conversations. And so the podcast is really just the beginning of it. There's more coming. I think there's a little bit of a demand to have more content on the website. So I'll probably start a blog that I don't think having me write every post is the way to go. I want to have a broader voice with that. So I probably will have a lot of guest posts there. I realized from my time as a park ranger and anywhere else, that overall people are just okay at email. But if people could get good at email or even great at writing email, in parks in particular, but overall, my view was at parks, if people in parks could get great at email, it would really help the team and speed things up. And so I have written my first book, or created my first guide. It's the Park Leader's Guide to Effective Email Strategies. And that's my first offering to kind of blend the business side with the park side. And that as we record this, I've finished it, but I haven't exactly launched it yet. So I don't quite yet know how guides will do, but that's
Right.
one of the directions I'm heading with it.
Wow, that's so awesome to hear, and just to be able to hear that story and to listen, because without my connection with you, I would have never come across your podcast or just to be able to hear what you're doing and to be teaching something, even in the industry that I was in. You know, I could email the CEO of our company, and I would hear him on conference calls and stuff like that. But to be able to be somewhere who's just starting out, like you said, when you started out, you were a camp ranger. To be able to come across your show and listen to, the director of, let's say, what was the park, the Ontario?
Yeah, Ontario Provincial Parks.
And that was the head person?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so to be able to, as a camp ranger, to be able to listen to him and be able to gain insight from that is just huge. And the medium that you're doing through podcasting, and it's such a great way to be able to get your message out there and to teach people. So I love the idea. I love the concept.
Yeah, thanks. And one of the exciting parts about it is, at least right now, nobody else has done anything like this for park professionals. So it's exciting to blaze the new territory, but also there's plenty of room to make mistakes, because it's a new market. It's new people to reach and provide things for them that they're not used to getting. So there's two sides to it. It's exciting because nobody's been there before, and it's sometimes confusing because nobody's been there before.
Right. And I can relate with that too, because when my first idea came about for S'more Outdoor, it started as a camping service in Yosemite and Sequoia. And when I was blogging, I was kind of all over the place. I didn't know what I wanted to talk about, didn't really know what my message was. And it was hard because I was kind of defeating myself in the sense that I don't even know where to go with this because it's new. I'm trying to intertwine the outdoors with a personal development and how it impacts you, and how the outdoors can impact you. But then I guess I was just kind of a little scared that I didn't want to do research to find out that somebody was already doing it or whatever. But eventually I came to the point, was like, it doesn't matter, because I can read all these different books that talk about it and just share the lives of others and share the story and share my story, and which is exactly what you're doing, and bringing that information and being the creative that you are to be able to figure it out as you go along.
Yeah.
Is something that's amazing. Well, thank you.
And sure. Figuring it out as you go along is one of the fun parts, because as you're finding out in podcasting, there are no rules, and there's nobody telling you that you have to do this and you can't do that. So we get to try new things. Recently, I did a panel discussion as a podcast episode just to see what it was like, and it turned out wonderful. It was about diversity in parks. Mm-hmm. Having more people of color on staff and visitors and so forth. And it went really good. And we can do those things because there's no rules.
There's no rules, yes. And whenever you want to come up with a new idea, I bet you just head outside and become inspired for that, right?
That's right.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and start winding down. I have a few more questions for you, as far as just some things that I want people to be able to understand and how they can at least start. For those of you that are driving to work or driving home from work right now, or listening to it while you're doing chores in your house, listening to the show. is just being able to get outside. You know, I'm looking out my window right now, and the neighbor across the street is mowing his lawn. You know, and something like that, it can either be a chore or it can be an experience. It just depends on how you view it. You know, I could go outside and cut the bushes because they need to be done, and I could see that as a chore because it needs to be done, or I can go out and get all creative and cut the bushes and just experience. But that's me, and that's kind of my nature. So I know not everyone is like me. But what do you do nowadays? What do you do as you're building your business to get outdoors?
Well, we try to get out, my family and I, we try to get out fairly often. And when we do get out, it's usually hiking. That's the big one. I mentioned canoeing is what really got me started. But living in Washington State, there's so much to do, and there's so many places to hike, and we live in Western Washington now on the Olympic Peninsula, and there's so many beaches to visit, and there's not as many rivers, at least right here. So I don't even own a canoe anymore. I ended up selling it. We hike a lot. My kids love to go geocaching, if you know what that is. And that's a real treat. They would hike in the woods anyway without complaining, but they would hike 10 miles one way just for the chance to find a Hot Wheels and an ammo box. So that adds a fun element for them. So that's mainly what I do. I just try to make sure I get a chance to get out, hopefully at least once a week for a good hike. Otherwise, I'll just walk my dog in the neighborhood or to a local park and just find a way or a time to get out and outside.
When you don't spend time outdoors, what negative effects do you see in your life and your business?
Oh man, if I go extended times, I mean, there's such an impact on health, I think, to spend it outdoors. So I just don't feel as well if I don't spend time outside. It's easier to put on weight if you don't spend time outside. And my wife would probably tell you I get grumpy, I get irritable. And sometimes if I work from home, so if I've spent a lot of time working on a project, I just have to get out. Even if it's a rainy day and getting out is driving the country roads around here, it still helps. It still helps. I just have to get out. I get that feeling. I can't quite describe it, but you probably know what it is. You just get that feeling that, boy, I've got to get outside, even if it's for 30 minutes.
Right. No, I know exactly what you mean. There's been a few times where I do have a national park pass, so because of the 3 parks around, but there's times when I just go up just to drive on new roads up in the park, not necessarily to go hiking, but just for that visual stimulation. That nature can bring, and rather than sitting in front of the computer screen or sitting in front of the TV, or just getting out there, even if it's raining, rolling the window down a little bit and just getting that fresh air is so beneficial.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of driving and road trips. It's such a neat way to see things. It's a little harder now that gas is so expensive, but I actually have an atlas. Every road I have been on since my 18th birthday, I have highlighted yellow.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's really neat to look at. But where I live, it's hard to find any new roads to turn yellow.
Right. No, and it's what you said about just going out there and just driving. I was out walking my dog yesterday, and there was a lady with her 3 kids. One of them, she was pulling in a trailer. The other 2 were riding a bike. Well, the one in the trailer I noticed was sitting there playing a video game. And I thought about when I was young, because we didn't have the handheld video games when we used to go on trips. We would either read comics or just stare out the windows as we were going through the mountains and stuff. But he was unfortunately missing so much as a child, I thought. Anyways, maybe he didn't care about the environment that was around us. But it was just brought a thought to my head. When I have kids, when my wife and I have kids, I want to make sure that they're not bringing their electronics with them when we're out exploring.
Yeah.
Because it takes away so much of the impact.
Right. I don't know if it counts as a drive if you're not looking out the window.
And hopefully when you are driving, you're looking out the window, right? Yeah, definitely. So how do you make sure that getting outdoors is one of the most important things that you do in your life?
Well, I am lucky enough to have the opportunity to work where I want. So if I don't need to be connected to the internet, I often will go and work from a park, even if it means sitting in my car and just looking at the water. There's a particular park locally that I like to go and work at. So that helps my inspiration. It helps me get things done. It helps me to not feel boxed in, especially if I have any writing to do. I will go and sit in that spot and write, because I do writing for myself, but I also do copywriting for clients. And so it helps to get somewhere else to do it. It helps me feel more creative. And I actually recorded a podcast episode from that spot recently just to try it out to see if it would work.
And I'm sure it worked excellent.
Yeah, it did. It did. So to say, how do I make sure it's one of the things I do? I just make an effort to do it, because working from home, if I didn't make the effort, it wouldn't happen. I'd spend all my time at home. Where if you have a job that you commute to and from, you have the opportunity to take a different route, or you have the opportunity to stop at a park or along a river and hike a short trail. Where there are many benefits of working from home. But the one dangerous one, for me at least, is if you're not deliberate, you never get out of the house.
I love that. If you're not deliberate, you never get out of the house. And that's a theme that I'm coming across, is making it a priority in your life. Now, I think that you answered my next question about one of your favorite places. Is that where you said you go there a lot just to kind of get away and think, and that's the spot that you go to consistently?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of answers there. There's this place called North Beach near Port Townsend, Washington, that I think I'm there probably at least twice a week doing work. So if I need to be creative, if I need to do something, if I'm going to write, then I will sneak away and go to North Beach. And my kids have even, if I come home in the middle of the day and they'll say, "Oh, where were you, Daddy? Were you at your spot?" So that's the one. I visit that a lot. But there's another favorite place that I haven't been to in years. And maybe in my mind, it's still this fantastic place because it's been so long since I've been there. But there's a place in Montana called the Yak Valley. And there's really nothing there except trees and a few people that live up there. But I used to love to just go to the Yak Valley and find a new place and discover new things. And so in my mind, that's still, if I could pick somewhere to go to today, that I might just visit the Yak. There's no parks there. There's no national park, but it's just a neat place that not a lot of people get to.
And that's sometimes when you find places like that, you can make it your own, because not a lot of people know about it.
Yeah. And there is a great author who I think he lives elsewhere in Montana now, but for several years he lived in the Yak Valley. Rick Bass. If you're not familiar with him, you should check him out. And a good place to start. He wrote books about living in the Yak, but one of my favorite books by him is The Lost Grizzlies, which is about Colorado. But he's a great outdoor author.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yak as in Y-A-C-K?
Y-A-A-K, I believe.
Y-A-A-K.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to go and look and do some research on that, I'll also have I'll search for it and have a link to it in the show notes if there's any information that I can find. A lot of people struggle with getting outdoors. And that's why I want to bring this message out, is just to help people find simple ways and become inspired to actually start getting outdoors more. What's the best advice that you have for someone who wants to get out more, but they struggle with the amount of time that they have?
Well, a theme that comes up more lately on the Park Leaders Show, we've been talking about how do we get people, for example, how do we get kids in Cleveland interested in Theodore Roosevelt National Park up in North Dakota? And as questions like that come up, what comes out more is you've got to connect them to their local park. And I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm fortunate enough to live in a place that has a lot of local county parks. But wherever you live, you're likely to have a city or a county park nearby, or even a trail along a river or through the woods. And I would say pick a spot. Like for me at North Beach, pick a local spot and visit there often. If you can only get out for 30 minutes a week, make it that spot. Find your spot. And then the more you visit there, the more you're going to start to feel connected to that spot. You'll notice as things change. You'll notice when something's different. You'll start to feel the seasons. As I only live in a place that has 2 seasons, but if you're in a place that has 4 seasons, you'll feel that as it all comes and it changes everything. And you'll start to feel connected to that spot. And then that spot starts to recharge you and refresh you. So if you can't get out much, or if you're struggling to find the time, start that way. Don't think, oh, I've got to go to Yellowstone to spend time outdoors. Just start with that local spot and make it your own.
Small Outdoor listeners, you can go and Google your local state park or local park and rec site. You can also go to smoreoutdoor.com. I've got a clickable map on there for your state, so you can actually look at the state park website and dive into there and do some research. Well, thank you so much for being with me and sharing your story today, Jody. Can you share with us some final words of encouragement and how S'more Outdoor listeners can connect with you?
Well, my final encouragement is to get out, which has kind of been the message. And I think of a quote from Mark Twain, who said, "I never let schooling interfere with my education." And for me, most of my real education has come outside. And just looking at things and poke at things, and it's all right to break things outdoors here and there. That's how you learn how things happen. So just get out there and explore and get the education. And if you want to connect with me, there's 2 ways. Your listeners are probably more interested in Park Leaders, and that's at parkleaders.com. And the show is on iTunes and Stitcher Radio, and on Twitter, look for Park Leaders. And you can connect with me outside of Park Leaders on Twitter at Jody Maberry, or my website, jodymaberry.com.
Thanks again for being here, Jody. I really appreciate your time, your input, and just really hearing your story around the outdoors and your life and how it has an impact in your life today. So
yeah, you're welcome, and I'm really pleased with what you're doing.
Awesome.
Just helping spread the message about the outdoors. It's great.
Thank you so much. That's it for today's episode of S'more Outdoor. I'm just so excited to be here with you today to share the stories and outdoor experiences from people like Jody. So a few things before I go. You can head on over to smoreoutdoor.com to see the recap of Jody's show on his show notes page, along with ways that you can connect with him. Just type Jody in the search bar. That's Jody. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, we would love it if you would leave a comment on his page where Jody and I will respond. To stay updated with new episodes, make sure you subscribe to the podcast by either clicking subscribe in iTunes, the subscribe button on Jody's show notes page, or from the app on your phone. If you would leave a comment and rating for the show in iTunes, that would be awesome. This helps to get the show noticed so others like you and I can learn about how the nature effect can have an impact in their lives and become inspired by these stories. Also, like us on Facebook at facebook.com/S'more Outdoor, and follow us on Twitter. My username is at BATrout. That's BATRAUDT. And make sure you sign up at S'more Outdoor. That way you won't miss any exclusive content I send out. I hope Jody's story has inspired you to reconnect with nature and start living with childlike wonder again. So thank you for tuning in to the show that's changing lives around the world. Until next time, I challenge you to do something this week to get S'more Outdoor.